Yes, I did. The people's champion, I'm animal for analysts. Career damaging versus meditating when candles lit.
Alright, now my turn. You may milk in this arc like an anime titty. I try to keep it short and I try to keep it witty. You can always count on me to dive into the nitty gritty. Rise up, you Brarians, this is Story Purist Committee. Why do I keep making videos instead of doing one and be done? Because my brain keeps adapting to new arguments like it's Maharaga. I made a video on this a year ago, but I can elaborate much better after this recent Taurus arc. I'm going to make up two terms. The first is closed critique. This is a critique that keeps out any biases, like social, political, and religious ones, and focuses on critiquing a story based on story-related concepts. It's not exempt from story-based biases, but it is exempt from non-story-based biases, maximizing the potential objectivity. These are story purists. They analyze storytelling in its purest form, that blue sky, that 99.1% pure crystal that makes you go, somebody cooked here. The second is open critique. This is a critique that includes biases like social and political ones. I believe that closed critiques are more valuable and respectable because they aim for more objectivity and grade the story as a story rather than as a piece of media that supports their personal beliefs. I believe that is the most honest type of story critique. Think about it like this. If every conversation about game design devolves into a social political debate, does that sound productive? Can't we talk about the game mechanics and how to make the most effective game design without descending into politics? Switch game with story. It's completely fine to avoid or dislike a story because it doesn't align with your open biases. I do that too. The problem is when you make a story critique and argue that the quality of a story decreases because it doesn't match your personal beliefs. Your enjoyment can go down. It happens to me too. But your enjoyment and the story quality are separate, or at least they should be. Can't we acknowledge that we didn't enjoy a story due to it not matching our open biases without arguing that the story's quality decreased because of it? Let me give some examples of critiques. In Save the Cat, Blake Snyder had a rule called double mumbo jumbo, which says that there should only be one piece of magic per movie because it would strain suspension of disbelief. He used Spider-Man 1's radioactive spider and goblin serum as an example. I completely disagree with this, but at least it's a closed critique. He's talking about how plot devices affect suspension of disbelief. That's purely story related, which is why I can respect it even if I disagree with it. Here's a more nuanced one. John doesn't like tsunderes. If he watches a show with a tsundere and says that the show is not well written because a tsundere exists and he doesn't like the archetype, that's an open critique. If John says that the story is not well written because the tsundere character acts in irrational and contradictory ways as a cheap trick to extend the plot, thus decreasing the audience's suspension of disbelief, that would be a closed critique. Jane believes in life lesson X. Story B's theme is X. If she says that story B is well written because the theme of the story is X, that's an open critique. If she says that B is well written because they properly established the truth and lie representatives, had dialogue that made their stances clear, had the two beliefs clash in interesting ways, and ultimately externalized the truth in the end, that would be a closed critique. The positive critique stems from the story-related reasons, not her personal belief in X. George doesn't like tokenization and race swapping. Movie D has a race swapped character. If George doesn't watch the movie due to the clashing beliefs, that's cool. If George argues that the story is of lesser quality due to the tokenization, that's an open critique and I don't respect it. What does race have to do with the elements of storytelling? At best, he could argue that the race swapping crushes suspension of disbelief, but that's on the visual level, not the story level. Character design may have some overlap with storytelling, but it's not really fundamental. It also requires context, because if it's a reboot, which it usually is, then the argument loses its closed validity because it's a different story. Viewers understand that JLU Batman isn't Batman from 2004. Jill doesn't like fan service. Anime K has a lot of fan service. If Jill doesn't watch K due to the clashing beliefs, that's cool. If Jill argues that K's story loses points in quality because of fan service, that's an open critique. It's irrelevant to storytelling. At best, she could argue that fan service is distracting and eliminates tension from scenes that are supposed to be tense. This is closed, assuming that the fan service is actually intense scenes. I may not agree with it, but at least it's closed. But this only works in that specific context. If there is fan service in light or comedic scenes, you can't really argue that it kills tension. Unfortunately, most critiques of fan service aren't closed like this. In conclusion, open critiques aren't naturally bad. I just believe that they aren't as valuable to fair story criticism because of the amount of biases unrelated to storytelling that are included. If you're trying to have an honest, productive discussion about storytelling, eliminating these biases makes the most sense. Otherwise, if two people are in a disagreement and using open critiques, the conversation will naturally go from discussing storytelling to discussing personal beliefs unrelated to storytelling, because it would be impossible to resolve the critiques without going to the source, the baggage of open biases. If you're arguing with George about tokenization, you will inevitably have to argue about whether race swapping is inherently bad or not, and that's not about storytelling anymore. If you argue with Jill about fan service, you will have to talk about whether sexualization is good or not, and that's not about storytelling anymore. If every conversation about storytelling devolves into a social political debate, does that sound productive? It doesn't to me, but that's just my opinion.